200 million people moved in days, not across borders, not across oceans, but across a digital frontier that had once been closed. It was not an army that crossed. It was students, farmers, entrepreneurs, families. For the first time, Africa switched on an internet of its own. The paradox is sharp. In Washington or Paris, sovereignty is praised as strength. In Ouagadougou, when Ibrahim Traoré speaks of sovereignty, over gold, over farms, over data, it is called dangerous, even reckless. Why is freedom celebrated in one place and questioned in another? This story is not about Wi-Fi speeds. It is about power. It is about who decides the rules of tomorrow. The guardians of Silicon Valley, or the citizens of a continent long defined by others. At just his mid-30s, Traoré embodies a generation unwilling to inherit dependency dressed as partnership. So the question stands, is Africa's digital independence a threat to the world order or the dawn of a fairer future? Stay with us, because this is more than a headline. It is a turning point. Subscribe now and walk with us through the story of sovereignty reborn. For decades, Africa lived on borrowed roads, not the roads of soil and dust, but the invisible highways of the digital age. Every message, every payment, every search query, whether from a farmer in Burkina Faso or a student in Nairobi, had to travel thousands of miles across oceans, routed through servers in Paris, London, or Seattle, before circling back home. It was like posting a letter to your neighbor by first sending it across the Atlantic. This was not just inefficient, it was humiliating. The architecture of dependence was designed in silence. American and European corporations built the pipes and collected the tolls. Google decided what knowledge was visible. Microsoft stored the continent's data in distant clouds. Amazon billed families in CD and CFA francs for every click, every lesson, every connection. Africans were not participants in the digital age. They were tenants on someone else's property. The cost was crippling. Studies showed that Africa endured some of the highest internet prices in the world, not because of lack of demand, but because it was essentially renting space on foreign infrastructure. A household in Ouagadougou might sacrifice groceries to pay school internet fees. A young coder in Lagos faced bills that swallowed half her income. Meanwhile, billions of dollars drained outward each year. 50 billion, a sum larger than the GDP of several African states, vanished annually into the coffers of Silicon Valley. But the price was not only financial, it was also intellectual. When a Ghanaian student searched the history of the Mali Empire, results showed Napoleon before Mansa Musa. Algorithms amplified foreign voices, burying African perspectives under layers of Western narratives. Knowledge itself was filtered. Identity itself was edited. This was dependency not only in wealth, but in imagination. Against this backdrop rose Ibrahim Traoré. In his speeches, he used simple images, the soil and the seed, the road and the bridge. He spoke not of bandwidth, but of dignity, not of megabytes, but of sovereignty. To him, digital servitude was merely another form of colonial chain, invisible, but binding. And he posed to his people a choice, as stark as any in history. The first path was safety through dependence. Continue to pay inflated fees. Continue to accept slow connections and filtered knowledge. Continue to let distant companies decide what was amplified and what was silenced. The path was predictable. It was comfortable, but it guaranteed perpetual subordination. The second path was untested. It meant building Africa's own digital highways, laying more than 100,000 kilometers of fiber, constructing 47 data centers, and adopting a protocol deliberately incompatible with the monopoly of Silicon Valley. It was costly, it was uncertain, and it was bound to provoke resistance from powerful forces. But it also promised something Africa had been denied for centuries: control over its own destiny. To many, this sounded impossible. Too expensive, too ambitious, too radical. Yet to others, especially the youth, it sounded like the only honest road forward. They had inherited a continent where resources flowed outward and voices were silenced. To accept dependence once more felt like surrender. To risk freedom, even at great cost, felt like dignity. And so, in late 2022, the vision was set in motion. Engineers drew maps across deserts and jungles, Policymakers debated in the African Union. Students shared Traoré's speeches on social media as if they were battle songs. The soil had been turned. The seed had been planted, but whether it would grow into a harvest or wither under pressure remained unknown. The moment approached when Africa would flip the switch, and the world would be forced to watch. Across deserts, through jungles, beneath rivers, the cables were laid. It was not a single nation's project, but a continental labor. Over 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic line stitched together capitals from Dakar to Nairobi. 47 data centers rose like monuments of steel and glass. For years, skeptics had said Africa lacked the scale, the money, the expertise. Yet on the ground, engineers pressed forward. Young graduates who had once dreamed of Silicon Valley now dug trenches in their own soil. Policymakers who once signed contracts with foreign firms now drafted blueprints for continental networks. Then came the moment of truth. The switch was flipped. Electricity surged. Protocols activated. Screens lit up. What followed stunned even the architects themselves. In less than a week, more than 200 million Africans migrated to the new system. No digital platform in history, not Facebook, not WhatsApp, not TikTok, had ever seen such adoption so quickly. The crisis, ironically, did not erupt in Africa, but in Silicon Valley. At Google headquarters, emergency meetings stretched into the night. Engineers realized that their crawlers could not index the African web by design. At Microsoft, executives discovered their cloud could not penetrate the new protocol. At Amazon, analysts warned of billions in lost revenue. The monopoly had not been challenged at the edges. It had been broken at the root. News spread like wildfire. Newspapers in London and New York printed headlines they had never imagined. Africa breaks free. Analysts scrambled for explanations. How had a continent long dismissed as dependent suddenly become the world's most daring innovator? Some called it reckless. Others called it revolutionary. Everyone agreed it was historic. Meanwhile, on the streets of Ouagadougou, Nairobi, Lagos, the mood was different. Students streamed lectures without interruption. Many for the first time. Farmers opened apps in their own languages, connecting to markets without middlemen. Families paid internet bills that no longer devoured half their wages. For the first time, one young woman posted on social media, "The internet feels like it belongs to us." The phrase went viral. Murals appeared on walls with slogans like, "Our data, our destiny." The symbolism was electric. For centuries, Africa's wealth had flowed outward. Gold, cotton, cocoa, oil, even the invisible wealth of data had been siphoned away. Now the flow reversed. The cables under the soil carried not only information, but dignity. And yet celebration was tempered by unease. Washington and Paris raised alarms about digital fragmentation. European ministers warned of instability. Tech corporations lobbied African governments to reconsider. The message from the old order was clear. Independence would not come without consequences. Inside Africa, too, doubts lingered. Could the infrastructure handle billions of daily transactions? Could local engineers sustain a network that even trillion-dollar corporations struggled to manage? Was this bold leap a foundation for sovereignty, or a gamble that might collapse under its own weight? The triumph was undeniable, but the storm clouds of resistance were gathering. The question now was not whether Africa could build, but whether it could endure. For the farmer in Bobo Dioulasso, the change was immediate. He opened an app, built in Ouagadougou, tracked market prices in real time, and sold his harvest without a middleman siphoning the profit. Faster, cheaper data meant better seeds, fairer trade, and a family no longer trapped in cycles of debt. For the student in Nairobi, the revolution felt like a liberation of the mind. Search engines now displayed African scholarship, digitized oral histories, and indigenous voices at the top of the page. No longer did Napoleon overshadow Mansa Musa. No longer did Africa's past vanish beneath Western footnotes. Doctors in rural clinics experienced it differently, but no less profoundly. Medical records and X-rays traveled instantly across secure local networks. Patients in villages who once waited weeks for a specialist's opinion now received answers in hours. The invisible border that had long separated rural Africa from the rest of the world began to dissolve. For entrepreneurs in Lagos, Accra, Johannesburg, the shift was economic oxygen. Payment systems no longer looped through Europe, slashing transaction costs. Startups that once struggled to compete with foreign giants now thrived on homegrown platforms. The money that had drained outward, $50 billion a year, now circulated within African economies, funding engineers, employing youth, fueling innovation. Each connection was not just a technical improvement, but a thread in a fabric of self-reliance. Politically, the impact was just as seismic. Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed by critics as too young, too radical, now stood vindicated. His rhetoric of sovereignty was no longer just words, but visible infrastructure. Fiber cables under the ground, data centers on the horizon, new networks pulsing with African life. These became the proof of his vision. His popularity soared not only in Burkina Faso, but across borders, where young Africans repeated his lines as rallying cries. Dependence ends the day we decide it ends. Yet sovereignty came with a shadow. Civil society groups warned that the same tools built for freedom could be turned into instruments of control. If governments owned the networks, would they respect liberty? Could censorship creep in under the banner of security? Could the promise of emancipation be twisted into a new form of captivity? The debate was fierce. Some saw Traoré as a liberator. Others feared the dangers of unchecked power. The tension reflected the deeper question: could independence coexist with accountability? This was not a theoretical concern. Across history, revolutions in anti-colonial Africa had sometimes been betrayed from within. Leaders who once preached freedom had later silenced dissent. The Internet revolution faced the same test. Would it nourish liberty or suffocate it? Would sovereignty be shared among the people or monopolized by the state? The stakes were high because the transformation was not merely technological, it was moral. For generations, Africans had been told they were too fragmented to act together, too dependent to innovate, too weak to resist. The Continental Internet Exchange shattered that narrative. But whether the new system would mature into a forest of freedom or collapse into another cage depended on the discipline of this generation. The victories were tangible. Families no longer had to choose between food and internet bills. Schools streamed lessons without interruption. Businesses cut costs. Farmers reached fairer markets. But beneath the triumph ran the current of doubt. The soil had been turned. The seed had been planted. But would the harvest truly belong to the people? And so the question deepened. Could Africa defend its sovereignty not only against the old empires abroad, but against the temptations within? In Washington, the mood turned anxious. Senators and tech executives gathered in closed rooms, debating whether sanctions could be justified under the banner of digital security. What troubled them was not only economic loss, but the precedent. If Africa could walk away from the monopoly, why could others not follow? Silicon Valley had built its empire on the assumption that the world had no alternative. That assumption was broken. In Paris and London, the concern was cultural as much as financial. For decades, European capitals had shaped narratives about Africa through textbooks, media, and digital channels. Now, search engines rooted in African languages and perspectives threatened to dismantle that influence. Commentators warned of digital fragmentation, framing Africa's independence not as liberation, but as chaos. Yet outside the traditional centers of power, the echoes were different. In South America, policymakers studied the African blueprint with open curiosity. Leaders in Brazil and Argentina asked whether regional networks could bring the same benefits: lower costs, stronger identity, resilience against foreign monopolies. In Asia, governments already experimenting with domestic internet models saw Africa as validation. What had been theory was now reality. The African Union, once criticized as toothless, suddenly found itself at the center of global diplomacy. Its role in coordinating the Continental Internet Exchange gave it unprecedented leverage. For the first time, Africa was not merely reacting to global debates, but shaping them. Journalists noted that discussions of African sovereignty were no longer confined to speeches. They were embedded in infrastructure, cables, and code. But admiration abroad was matched by resistance. Western corporations lobbied fiercely, offering new contracts and incentives to African governments, willing to reopen their gates. Think tanks in Washington published papers warning of security risks. Editorials in European newspapers suggested that Africa's independence was destabilizing the global order. The narrative battle was as fierce as the technical one. Still, the fact remained. Africa had done what many said was impossible. It had turned from consumer to creator, from tenant to architect, and in doing so, it had forced the world to reckon with a new reality. The question was no longer if Africa could sustain this revolution, but whether the old powers would allow it to survive. The revolution had been lit, but the fire still needed tending. Across Africa, the new digital highways promised prosperity. Lower costs meant more families online, more students learning, more entrepreneurs creating. The $50 billion that once drained away each year could now fund engineers, seed startups, and strengthen local economies. For the first time, Africa could imagine exporting not only minerals and crops, but software, knowledge, and innovation born on its own soil. Yet opportunity always comes with risk. Building infrastructure is one thing, sustaining it is another. Servers need constant maintenance. Networks require upgrades. Engineers must be trained and retained. The financial burden is heavy, and foreign creditors wait in the wings, ready to exploit any gap. The temptation of easy loans or quick deals could reopen the very gates that had just been closed. Then there is the political challenge. A network born in the name of freedom could be misused by governments seeking control. Already, activists warned that sovereignty must not become a shield for censorship. True independence would require not only cables and code, but transparency, accountability, and vigilance. If liberty is lost, what use is sovereignty? Internationally, pressure will not fade. Silicon Valley may regroup. Western governments may design new rules, new trade barriers, new narratives. The victory of today could provoke the counterattack of tomorrow. To survive, Africa must be not only bold, but disciplined, not only united in pride, but steadfast in practice. And so the metaphor returns. The soil has been turned. The seed of sovereignty has been planted. Shoots of hope are already visible in schools, clinics, and markets. But a harvest requires patience, care, and endurance. The question that remains is whether this generation will protect the field or allow weeds of dependency to grow again. Because history shows that every revolution faces its reckoning. The question is no longer whether Africa can plant the seed, but whether it can reap the harvest. For generations, Africa was told it was too weak, too divided, too dependent. Every road seemed to lead outward, every resource drained away, every voice filtered through foreign gates. But now the cables under the soil tell another story. Africa is no longer a tenant on borrowed infrastructure. It is a builder of its own foundations. The message is simple yet profound. Anti-colonial Africa is not only history written in blood and protest. It is alive today in fiber, in code, in the quiet click of a student streaming her first uninterrupted lecture. It is in the dignity of a farmer trading fairly, in the relief of a mother who no longer chooses between food and connection. The harvest of sovereignty is not distant. It is here, lived daily. This journey also carries a warning. Sovereignty is fragile. It requires responsibility as well as defiance, discipline as well as courage. African sovereignty will endure only if governments resist the temptation to replace one form of domination with another. The challenge is not only external, from Washington, Paris, or Silicon Valley, but internal, from within the very systems now being built. And yet the promise remains larger than the peril. If one continent long dismissed as dependent can claim its digital future, then why not others? Why not South America, Asia, even communities within the West itself? Dependence is not destiny. The example of anti-colonial Africa proves that chains, whether of iron or of algorithms, can be broken. The story does not end here. It begins here. A seed has been planted. A seed of dignity, of freedom, of hope. What it grows into will depend on the hands that tend it. If you believe this moment matters, do not let it fade. Share this story. Speak it aloud. Let it travel further than any cable. And if you want to witness the next chapter with us, subscribe now. Because history is still being written, and your voice belongs in it.